The year was 1999, and as a young lad, I only cared about two things: my Pokemon action figures and Chicken McNuggets. I was just the king of the world at 3 years old. However, that day would soon change as my dad would bring home a new gaming console for us, which was the PlayStation, and he also brought home an assortment of games to play. Among this list was things like Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot 3, and two games of the same franchise, Resident Evil 1 and 3. Even at 3 years old, I would still remember I would be having evenings with my parents as they would sit down and get lost in these worlds, whether it was solving puzzles and fighting zombies in Resident Evil, or solving puzzles and killing dinosaurs in Tomb Raider. I will always cherish these memories growing up, as video games were, pretty prevalent in my household growing up. However, one game always stood out to me, and that was Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. I remember the first time I saw the cover art for this game. On the front, this mangled looking zombie man had stapled skin over his eye, no discernible lips to cover his gums and teeth, and these fleshy tubes that wrapped around his body, and on the back, a young woman standing next to some screenshots of gameplay showing her running through what can only be hell on earth. Obviously, I couldn't read at the time, being 3 years old, but this cover art and the back art of this game had my mind all over the place. Who is this monster? Why is this girl so important? Mom, where are my Chicken McNuggets? I'm starving. Eventually, my parents meet Resident Evil 1. They shot the big boss zombie at the end. They flew out on the helicopter to get out of the mansion just at the nick of time. But our next game was Resident Evil 3. Mostly because we didn't have Resident Evil 2. But let me tell you what, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was everything to me. Just from the intro, you see everything you need to know. You see Jill back in action, ready to face off against another nightmare. Large quantities of zombies lurking in the city streets. And then you see him, the man on the cover, Nemesis. I still remember in first grade, we would play this game on the playground, which was basically like G.I. Joe, but if instead of Cobra versus the Joes, it was just boys versus girls. On the boys' side, you had soldiers, scientists, and monsters. And obviously, I wanted to be a monster because, one, I can make pretty sick growl sounds as a kid, but also I really liked Kane from WWE. I don't like Kane from WWE anymore, though. But besides that, my inspiration for the monster that I ended up being was Nemesis. I would run around showing my teeth off at people and walking around saying stars, because to me, he was the peak boss monster and nobody could stop him. Nemesis isn't your typical boss monster, but he also isn't your typical zombie in a game that you shoot a few times and then watch them clearly fall to the ground and not shake, and as you walk over to them, they bite you. Inspired by the Terminator, Nemesis is just what you expect him to be: an inescapable agent of chaos that was designed to do one thing: kill STARS members, and is a constant threat throughout the entire game. In the two games prior, you had RE1, which featured a tyrant at the end of the game, and in RE2 you had Mr. X, a walking tyrant that could give you a big old punch, but he would just walk around and be, for the most part, just a bullet sponge you had to deal with. But with RE3, they took a jetpack, strapped it onto the back of that game, and just But with RE3, they took the tyrant concept from RE2, strapped a jetpack to it, and just let it fly. You see, Nemesis isn't your typical boss monster because he isn't a static boss enemy, meaning he can do what he wants. You run away, Nemesis is there too. Oh, you want to fight back? Don't worry, he's already charging at you as you're running away to prep to shoot him. Oh, you're actually far away from him? Oh, great, he has an RPG too, and he's already shot it. When I finally had my go at playing this game on my own, I played as conservatively as possible. I would maneuver around zombies and other monsters just to save as much ammo and health as possible. But when Nemesis would blast through a window with his RPG, I would lose all sense of what made me a good player, and I would flail around the map until I could either muster up enough courage to fight him or do what I would normally do, which was hide in a safe room until I was ready to run again. I think that's why the save room music for Resident Evil 3 is a very comforting sound to listen to whenever I'm just getting stuff done, making videos and whatnot. As time went on, I would play this game enough times to learn when he would appear. I also learned how to dash and roll away when he would get too close and do his hit animation. This would be crucial if you were the type of gamer who wanted to kill him and get some free loot. But even with these tips and tricks, there's no doubt that his sporadic movements would still deal you a difficult encounter every time you would face him. That's why I consider Nemesis a Dark Souls boss OG. Because much like the Dark Souls bosses that you sweat over and get angry at, he shares 3 common strats in order to beat him: patience, skill, and pattern recognition. Patience is key for both of these types of bosses because one false move, one preemptive strike, and you may have missed your opportunity, and they may have not done an animation yet, or they were prepping to hit you, and now you're just closer now to deal any kind of damage they want to you. But the problem is with Nemesis, he can cancel out attacks. So, that's another added benefit to Nemesis. Skill is also a necessity for any game, but with bosses like this, you need to be able to react at any moment when they're going to do anything. So constantly dodging, rolling, making space in between you and them is crucial to being successful. And then lastly, pattern recognition is a key to fighting these guys. It's a lot easier to do that against the Dark Souls bosses. With Nemesis, you don't know what he's going to do. He could last minute cancel out an attack, and then he's just going to hit you with his RPG, or later on in the game, he has tentacles he can just grab you with. But, that is where really the similarities between these two types of characters end. Because Nemesis, again, has extra things that go for him to be successful, and here's those reasons. Because while Dark Souls has a targeting system and a hard cam, Resident Evil 3 has 0 targeting and forces you to fight a mutant man through the lens of a fixed camera angle that will move depending on what part of the room you're standing in. I can't tell you how many times I would fight Nemesis and I'm in the middle of the action, I'm up close in a hallway, and out of nowhere, he's about to hit me. I decide to do a little roll to get out of the way, and now I'm in the nosebleed seats as I'm trying to readjust my aim. And Nemesis, well, guess what? He's already locked in on me, and I'm dead. Thank you, Nemesis. But this is what makes Resident Evil 3 such a great survival horror game, and why it just adds to the legacy of Nemesis and why he is a better boss than most Dark Souls bosses. Another thing that Nemesis does in this game that is game breaking and makes the game just a little bit more difficult is midway through the game, he becomes a different type of boss completely. There's a fight in this game where you are up against Nemesis and you defeat him, and it looks as though he dies. He falls into a fire, and it looks as though it's the end of him. Because now, Nemesis is a shirtless hunk that is sporting new tentacles that are flailing around, ready to grab you at your ankles, pick you up in the air, slam you down, and throw you around the room. And when you're down, he can still attack you. Fun. And then lastly, he does have one final transformation to be the final boss in the ending of the game. And this boss is very claustrophobic. He basically just becomes a giant organ monster that is more animal than man. It can shoot acid across the room and uses its massive body to corner you and swing its claws and tentacles at you. I think they were just going to have Nemesis be the same old original boss throughout the entire game. I think it would have been a little bit more basic, and I think you would have just caught on to how he does things. Yes, he's still a terrifying stalker throughout the game that at any moment you never feel safe, but you would learn his quirks and you could prepare for him. By doing this, you give yourself a chance to have to adapt to a new boss and figure out how to beat him this time. Nemesis is always going to be one of my favorite bosses, but what Capcom did later on for this character kind of upset me. Nemesis has been in other titles, from fighting games to arcade shooters, and every time he's in these games, I'm always super excited to see him in there. Marvel vs. Capcom, anytime I get to play those games, I'm picking Nemesis because he is just one of my favorite. He's one of my favorite characters. I know he's gonna pick him. He's the same. I feel the same way about Nemesis, the same way I do about Donkey Kong whenever I'm playing Mario Party. They are one and the same.
Okay.
But what they did to this guy in 2020 was unimaginably bad. And I'm not talking about the pandemic. I'm talking about the remake for Resident Evil 3. There was a huge opportunity to remake this game and add to the game's legacy. I mean, we had even seen Capcom the year prior do this with Resident Evil 2. They took the concept of Mr. X's Tyrant and just turned it up like 10 notches. I can't tell you how many times I played Resident Evil 2 and I was just like terrified. You're doing your own thing. You're still dealing with some pretty difficult zombies. And then out of nowhere, you hear the footsteps coming towards you. Chills. I just recently watched a video about stalkers. I'm gonna list the video here. I can't think of his name off the top of my head because I think I just watched it today. But it was a video about stalkers. He did an amazing job, and yeah, Mr. X's footsteps are terrifying. It gave me the same feeling I felt with Nemesis. So obviously I was like, oh man, this is awesome. What are they gonna do with Nemesis? Because obviously he can blast through walls out of nowhere. I bet they're gonna have a lot of like breakable objects in the game. They could probably, take that concept and just ruin the buildings. So I was really excited to see what they were gonna do. Instead, we were giving a monster that was a scuffed reflection of its original concept. Nemesis had lost everything that made him so special. From his adaptive fighting to the way it felt like he could pop up and get you at any moment. It was all gone. And what made it worse was when he did transform into his second form, it wasn't the way that he was before. It's now he's this dog man that's stuck in his own little area as a mini boss. Sure, there was moments where he was still definitely intimidating. I know there's pockets of the game where he can stalk you as you're trying to get stuff done. And that stuff was cool. But it felt like just a throwaway part of a game. And it just wasn't the same Nemesis that we had 20 years ago. To wrap this up, I'm just going to say that regardless of how I feel about the remake of Resident Evil 3, they still created one of the greatest bosses of all time in Nemesis. And Capcom is still killing it right now with Resident Evil. Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, probably some of my favorite Resident Evils since Resident Evil 3. I liked Resident Evil 4. I didn't care for Resident Evil 5, and I never played Resident Evil 6. I didn't want to. So what they're doing now, bringing back these remakes. They remade Resident Evil 4, which I have not played yet, but I plan on doing that soon. They're killing it. I'm only even more excited to see what they're gonna do next with the franchise, and just see where they're gonna go after Village. So, that in mind, I'm still a Capcom fan regardless, and I'm still a Nemesis fanboy. So he has delivered plenty of experiences of fear and fun for players all over the world and families of 3 since 1999. If you liked this video, please hit a like button right there. And if you liked hearing what I have to say and you want to hear what I have to say even more, hit the subscribe button, because I'm Timbo and I just talked about that. Peace.